This is a production of Cornell University.
Thank you, Rebecca, for that introduction, and thank you everyone for joining this afternoon. Like Rebecca said, I'm going to be talking about a topic that maybe a lot of you are not familiar with, but that's a personal and professional passion of mine. How do you integrate gender issues specifically and social difference into plant breeding programs? So brief outline, I'll start with some slides on conceptual clarity for the first third of my talk. That's just to kind of level the playing field. So as I'm talking about some concepts, that you're all at least familiar with what I mean. The second third of the talk will looking at how the issue of integrating gender and social difference into plant breeding has been framed more recently. And the last third will really talk about a research case study from NEXTGEN Cassava and how practically we've approached this question and implementation. So conceptual clarity is very important because, as you know, if you're speaking two different languages, and a lot of this work is very interdisciplinary, that can have repercussions on misunderstandings or kind of not being able to move forward together. The next few slides I'm going to borrow heavily from a program that I'm involved as a co-PI that's called GREAT, and this is a gender training program for agricultural researchers in sub-Saharan Africa, and it's a joint certification between Makerere University and Cornell University, so I'm borrowing a lot from those slides for this first third. And just a quick shout out to Margaret Mangeni here in my co-PI in the picture here, and her fantastic training team at Makerere for producing some of this material. And some familiar faces. Margaret has guest lectured with us, as has Eva, who was one of the co-presenters in the series a few weeks back. So there's more information on the website if you're interested. So the first thing first disclaimer perhaps to mention is that everything I'm going to talk about from here on out is really the treatment of gender in agricultural research, agricultural development is very narrow in its definition. So we talk about women versus men, or we talk about female versus male, but we don't really address it in the complexity that you see in feminist gender and sexuality studies, where you look at the multiple layers of gender identity, expression, and sexual orientation. So that's not a choice on my part, but the fact that a lot of the literature and a lot of the work historically has really treated gender identity to be binary. And there's a lot problematic with that. And there are glimmers of hope and a bit of research going on in different areas, but by and large, it has remained very binary. So a lot of the times, the first thing we start with is the difference between sex and gender. And I'll just spend a few minutes on this. Sex is biologically defined and acquired at birth. Males and females are defined independently of one another, and the definition is mostly the same around the world. Whereas gender is completely socially defined. It's culturally learned differences between what it means to be a man or what it means to be a woman. The gender is really defined as a relational concept, socially constructed and relational. What that means is what it means to be a man is defined in relation to what it means to be a woman. And these relationships are usually relationships of power. And the definition of what it means to be a man or what it means to be a woman vary greatly across geographies, but also across time. So it's not a static concept, it changes continuously. And that'll become a little bit clearer why we're making this distinction later on. A few more concepts as a glossary. Gender roles, I'll talk about this a little bit, are the behaviors, tasks, and responsibility that are considered appropriate for men and women. And these are social cultural norms. So they're defined by social society and culture. And for example, of this could be in agriculture, women weed where men prepare land. So these are the roles of men and women across the agricultural value chains for different crops. Gender relations are the social relationships of power between men and women. They're really shaped again by social beliefs and institutions. And you see this a lot in agriculture research in the way that husbands are by default defined as heads of households, and that they are the decision makers for the household. That's a relationship of power between a husband and a wife. Gender stereotypes are kind of beliefs about certain groups or types of individuals that are based not on evidence, but on assumptions. And this is really important. For example, a lot of times you'll see stereotypes around men's or women's crops, certain men's or crops or women's crops. What does that mean? Or that women are too weak to operate machinery, for example, or that they can't engage in certain activities in agriculture. And that's not really based on evidence, but really socially constructed norms. This is a really important concept, intersectionality, and you may have seen this of late mentioned more recently. This concept emerged by Kimberly Crenshaw to really define the double whammy of sexism and racism and how those two coming together excluded Black women specifically from feminist movements. So it's really grown since that initial definition to raise awareness around there is no universal women or men, for example, as we're talking about men and women in agricultural research. All women and men do not share the same experiences, so you can't generalize. And there's multitudes of other identities that overlap and interact with gender to really define those individuals' lived experiences. And what this means, again, for agricultural research is not all women who may also be farmers benefit from the same solutions, and who they are and where they live and their lived experiences will really impact how they're benefiting from different interventions. And another concept that I'll talk about repeatedly is interdisciplinarity. And most of you know what this means, but I just want to point one thing out, that is in the more objectivist sciences that we engage in, we seek truths, and there's singular ways of knowing and truths that we look for. Whereas in the social sciences, it's generally accepted that as an individual researcher, you have a position and that you should be open and forward with that position and lay that forward before you even make your claims. And that the claims that you make are truth claims, not absolute truths, and that there may be multiple ways of knowing. And what that means is, I think, is really important for us to realize is, as we all personally carry these positions, norms, stereotypes, biases, and beliefs, these really play into everything that we do. The research topics we choose, the questions we ask, our approaches, the teams that we put together, and actually the outcomes from that research as well. And that's really important, as I'll show on the next slide, is if you have a critical mass of individuals with similar norms, stereotypes, biases, or beliefs, that can actually shift a field in a certain direction and be more exclusionary. So an example of that is, this is the work of Londa Schiebinger in Stanford University. This is a great website called Gendered Innovations, where she looks at case studies around sex and gender analysis, mostly in health and medicine and engineering. So this left-hand side is a case study that she's developed around crash test dummies. So crash test dummies are usually modeled on, or always modeled on, the male body. What that means is all of the crash testing that's done and all of the kind of safety measures that are taken are based on the male body. But what that means is, if you have a pregnant woman, those seatbelts and the airbags are actually detrimental to a pregnant woman. So you have higher fatality from pregnant women in crash because they just haven't been considered in design. And that may be because most of the engineerings could have been men and couldn't have considered the different repercussions. A second really poignant example, I think, is the heart disease in women. The white male body is taken as standard for both symptoms and treatments for heart attack symptoms. What that means is, women experience heart attacks very differently, and the treatment needs to be different at times. So women actually die of heart attacks more commonly than men do, because they're not even realizing that they're having a heart attack. So again, these norms and maybe critical masses of researchers, individuals, assuming the white male body as the norm has had some serious repercussions societally and in design of health and medicine interventions. So what does that mean for gender and agriculture research and development? The last concept I'm going to introduce is what's called gender-based constraints. And these are really important for agriculture because everything we've talked about is there are different restrictions on men and women's access to resources and opportunities. What these culminate to are the gender-based constraints, so how they're constrained in interacting with agricultural opportunities. For example, for a smallholder in any setting globally, small land sizes are an issue, generally. You have limited range of finance and credit options. You may have limited access to markets or productivity. But if you look at gender-based constraints specifically, there may be laws or customs that specifically restrict women's land ownership. You may have bank policies that require married women to claim their husband's signatures. And I recently learned that this was true until 1996 in Australia, for example. So these are very pervasive. And social norms that limit women's networking abilities to even access information. And that they don't enjoy the same distribution of household income, and that the benefits from agriculturally based livelihoods may be different for men and women even within the same household. So all of this kind of culminates into what's described as a gender gap. And these are, FAO put these global numbers together about 5-6 years ago. And what you find is in plots managed by men versus plots managed by women, there's 20 to 30% yield gap. Same crops, same regions. And if you look at land holding globally, women own just a fraction of all agriculturally productive land. They enjoy fewer years of formal education, less access to finances and credit, and as well as fertilizers and seeds and inputs. So the bottom line really is gender determines everything a farmer has the right to access: land, labor, inputs, information, and women and girls specifically face systematic barriers to owning and managing farms. And the solution to this, and basically in the spheres of agricultural research for development, are really seen in two different but overlapping ways of describing the problem. One is the effectiveness argument, which means by including women and really catering to their needs, that you could have more adopted and effective interventions. But the flip side of that is also recognizing that it is the right thing to do. It is the just thing to do to really try to reduce and turn around social inequalities historically, which have excluded women and girls from equivalent life outcomes. So at this point in my talk, usually I have people ask me, what does this have to do at all with plant breeding? And I'll go into a few different ways that the problem has been described more recently. Personally, I think plant breeding should be more about people than plants, because I think the people are the one growing the plants and they have a lot to say about how we should be designing the varieties. When you look across a recent review about 2 years ago, and this is again for public sector breeding, international agricultural breeding programs, most of these programs define breeding objectives through expert input. What does that mean? Breeders talking to breeders, breeders talking to key stakeholders, but not really having those feedback loops between the communities that are adopting the varieties and the breeding priority setting. There's a tension between geography and demography. So there's been work by past breeders and researchers, for example, Ava, who was featured again a few weeks ago, but also Bettina Hassman, looking at redefining a target environment to not just be natural, quote unquote, but also socioeconomic. Can we kind of do G by E by M by social context? So there's a lot of complexity here, but it's really important. And a recent review showed that if you look at the gender balance of traits across multiple crops, that you see that the traits follow gender divisions of labor and market access. So again, it's really important to understand who is growing and interacting with the crops, because that experience is shaping is the traits that they're preferring. And the last point I think is really important, because it is a decision, it's a power decision. So who is deciding what's being prioritized for whom, when, and how is, I think, a really pertinent question. So related to that last one, if you may know that we have an innovation lab for crop improvement that got granted last year, and I serve as the associate director, but also a lead for a work package called priority setting. I co-lead this with Miguel Gomez at Dyson, his student Sergio, and also Elizabeth Carno, who's a postdoc that I work with here. So we're really trying to flip the paradigm a little bit and be more specific with the programs we work with to articulate their intended impact. So not just general in terms of disease resistance, but really trying to nail down exactly who they're looking to impact and how, and that intended impact would feed back to the prioritization and product development. So it's kind of the seamless pathway. And we're looking at different levels of prioritization. For example, prioritizing problems. What issues are more important than others, and how is that importance placed based on what? And is it an issue that's solvable by breeding, first of all? And also prioritizing solutions. Which alternatives, for example, different product profiles or different paths or breeding pipelines could have greater impact for the intended beneficiaries? What is that impact and how is it measured? So we're really thinking at this as very broad levels, and we're not only bringing in gender and youth research, but thinking about nutrition research, resilience, and market information. And the big picture is really, how do you distill all of that, which is mostly social science, into breeding priorities? A second big movement in this area, I would say, has come from what's called the Gender Breeding Initiative. And this is led by the RTB CRP of the CG. That's a lot of acronyms, but for those of you related, this is the Root and Tuber Banana Coordinated Research Program of the CG. And this is a group of us of gender researchers, breeders, but social scientists, and many different workshops we've had and discussions to really develop accessible and simple communications products for the community to understand what does it mean to be gender responsive in breeding. So just central tenets is knowing when and where women are important beneficiaries and knowing how to engage them, anticipating how design decisions can impact women and be impacted by their roles, and being intentional in designing breeding objectives and products for women and girls. And lastly, being accountable. So making sure as we're measuring the success of these breeding programs that we're doing so with an intention to have positive impact on women and girls. So we've developed some frameworks around this, looking at the breeding cycle and looking at decision points around the breeding cycle. Where are decisions that need to be made, and how can we have intentional gender responsive results from those decisions? So if you're interested, if you just Google Gender Breeding Initiative, all this material will come up. But I just want to draw your attention to this slide because I think it's important sometimes as plant breeders, I hear claims that this is out of my space. I can't influence social dynamics. I can only breed varieties. And I think these case studies that we put together really illustrate that that's not necessarily true. So 3 examples I want to draw your attention to. The first is maize in China. And in this particular case, inclusion of women in participatory breeding really expanded their horizon and enlarged their network. So it wasn't just the fact that they were included, but that had a positive outcome in their networks, in their social networks, which is a good thing. The second case is from Fred Rotunde and Eva Weltzin, again in sorghum in Mali, that is, as they engage women in seed production activities at village cooperative levels, they saw that women's preferred varieties were being included more often when women were included in those processes. But again, the flip side is that the act of inclusion that women were now engaged in seed production meant they could diversify their economic activities. And the last is from barley in Syria, from Alessandra Gali, looking at just, again, the simple inclusion of women in participatory breeding activities led them to be recognized as farmers. And this is a systematic problem that women's labor and inputs into agriculture production are not recognized or remain invisible. So these are all very positive potential life outcomes just by simple inclusion and kind of participation of women in breeding activities. A third framework I want to draw your attention to, because I think you may have run into it, is we're seeing a lot of the Excellence in Breeding platform overhauls of the CG visions for breeding. So what this means is the EIB is really bringing a more market-based or industry model to CG breeding programs. And the really heart of that is knowing who and what you're breeding for. So this is a kind of, again, shift in terms of starting with the clients and the consumers and the users and working back to breeding priority setting. So this has been a big shift in the CG over the last couple of years. This slide is from Peter Coldrake, who's working with EIB right now to put together the new tools for the EIB on market segmentation, product concept development, and product profile development. And we've been working with him through the leadership of Vivian Pilar at SIP, who also leads the Gender Breeding Initiative. And this is kind of what was originally planned as you look at the obviously biological, regional, environmental variability, you look at the value chain that crop in that region is being funneled towards. And then you kind of define a market segment that leads to a product concept that leads to a product profile. So what we've done as a group is push back on this a little bit and said, where does the kind of social fabric come in? How do you define your consumers and how do you integrate this into the current model? And we've done that through adding the square that we're going to have a feedback session with them. So this is not final, but this is our proposed kind of integration, is adding a customer profile that really defines the social characteristics of the potential customers and including the social differences and how they would be potentially differentially impacted or benefiting from the different product concepts. And Vivi and Jackie Ashby together have put together different tools, again, to integrate into the more EIB model as you develop a product profile. They've developed this, what's called a product profile tool, which you apply to existing product profiles to query each trait to see, are there potential increases in drudgery, displacement of activities for women, or decrease in control of benefits? And if so, this goes into this left-hand bucket to say we should weight these traits negatively. So So not including them would be ideal because they may have a potential harm for women and girls. And this right-hand side is, if you look trait by trait, is there evidence of a reduction of drudgery or more income generation or enhancement of women's roles in that crop, that those traits could be weighted more positively and included in the product profile. So this has been tested now, is being tested now on 4 different systems around bean, cassava, sweet potato, and wheat, just to see if this tool is working on existing product profiles. So there's a lot of exciting stuff going on there. And I just want to end this section in terms of framing, saying that the biggest problem I think we face in this space is that there's a lack of evidence. What does that mean? That a lot of times I get asked the question, so can you point me to an example where there's been a variety that has been developed that has positive impact on women and girls? And the answer to that is there is no such variety. There's some evidence of negative impacts, but I'll speak to 2 studies recently that really illustrate this, that I was involved in a review of the root tuber banana consumer preferences and the drivers of adoption. So there were 3 hypotheses: that consumer traits were driving adoption, lack of insufficient attention to gender was negatively impacting adoption. And so the first hypothesis was found to be true based on the evidence that the consumer traits that were when consumer traits were included, you had higher adoption. But the second hypothesis, to be able to say, because we're not paying attention to gender, there's a penalty on adoption, there wasn't enough studies to even say yay or nay. So it was inconclusive. And the second piece here is in a scoping study, which is kind of a systematic review that we did, around 200 papers in depth, looking at how the adoption of climate resilient varieties were impacting resilience for communities. So I was looking at the social differences and looking to see if there was enough evidence to say that sex or gender were really impacting the adoption of these varieties. And what we found is either there was no sex disaggregation of data, or there were very few women who were involved, so we couldn't make any claims around that either. Again, there was this big gap in evidence and lack of studies. So in this last kind of quarter of the talk, I'd like to give some examples. So what does this all mean, and how does this operationally look like in an ongoing research project? The subject of study is what's called the NEXTGEN Cassava project. You may have heard this by now, but it's a large project, Gates Foundation and DFID funded. We're in our 7th or 8th year at this point, and I lead what's called the survey division under NEXTGEN Cassava. So I'll give you some examples of how we've approached this problem. So the overall aim of the survey division is to have really actionable breeding targets that meet diversity and demand. So the actionable breeding targets is the hard part, I have to say. Now we approach this in 3 different, I would say, different ways. Sorry, there's some feedback. 3 different streams of work, and the first is what is called trait descriptors. What that means is we've done a lot of work, both with NEXTGEN Cassava in collaboration with other programs such as RTB Foods, which is a large research project I'll talk about in a minute, to really go out and ask consumers, processors, and farmers, what are the ideal characteristics that they're looking for in an ideal cassava variety? So this is really asking, what are you looking for? And it's really open, very qualitative, just to understand the words that respondents are using and seeing if those correlate to any traits that can be bred for. The second kind of quadrant here is around typologies and economic values, and looking at, okay, now that we know which characteristics respondents are looking for, can we take those and really understand, doing choice experimentation, how relatively important these are, and develop some typologies, but also economic values. And I'm labeling here the countries that this work is taking place in. And we're also looking at using household surveys to complement not only the choices that respondents are making, but how that relates to their demographic information. So there are specific drivers of those choices that we can explain with different individual social identities. And the last part is the on-farm performance. So we're using a method called TRICOT, which I'll explain a little bit later. But the idea here is that in these first 2, the top quadrants, what we're asking is explicit or explicit kind of articulation of the desired traits and the rankings of those. But what we see is sometimes implicit choices don't really follow those explicit articulations. So what we're trying to do here is triangulate the explicit articulation of desired traits and the relative ranks and weights of those with the choices that are made by the very same individuals, because the same individuals will be undergoing all of these different methods, that on farm we look to see if that correlates or if that really is in line with the choices that farmers are making with varieties. So looking at the first quadrant, or the trait descriptors, this is work we did in the first phase of NEXTGEN, that we looked at kind of broad brush gendered use and trait differences and gender roles for cassava in Nigeria. And what we see, and we knew this historically, that women really dominate cassava processing and marketing of processed products in Nigeria. That's a given. They provide labor for processing as well as production. So that's kind of their gender role. What we see is when we look at traits articulated to be important by men and women, there's some commonalities in traits, but then there's some traits that are really different. For example, women were prioritizing cooking and processing traits, which makes sense because that's their role, because they're more involved in cassava processing. So that kind of lays the groundwork for cassava in Nigeria. But I think this left-hand figure really shows the interesting part about intersectionality. If you look at this right-hand side, when we look at all men and women across Nigeria from our kind of surveys, if you look at how people, or men and women, are saying their household use of cassava, you see that women or men will more often mention that they're selling fresh roots of cassava, whereas women may more often be mentioning they're processing and selling the processed product. So if we take this at face value, we can say that generally men are selling fresh, whereas women are processing and selling. But what we then did is we broke this down and disaggregated by region in addition to sex. And what you see is that effect is really coming from the southwest of Nigeria, whereas in the southeast, the picture is very different. And you can explain this because in the southeast, women are called cassava queens. So they're very involved in marketing of cassava in any form. Whereas in the southwest, the men and women are engaging in cassava markets differently. So we can't make broad brush generalizations for the whole country. So that was kind of the lesson learned there. Feeding on from that, recently over the last 3 years in this new project called RTB Foods, working with gender experts as well as food scientists and breeders, we've developed, kind of scaled out this idea in terms of how do you kind of get to the bottom of some of these consumer and consumption traits and do that across multiple root tuber and banana varieties across sub-Saharan Africa. So what we've done is, this is again been recently published if you want to look it up, but it's a multi-step interdisciplinary method and it's very participatory. So a lot of the work is happening with processors and consumers of these crops, and there's about 13 different food products around 10 different countries. So if you look at the data emerging from that in terms of the gender analysis, it's kind of impossible to ignore the role of women across all of the RTB crops in terms of processing, selling, and food preparation. So really they are the key informants in that role. So consultation with women across all the value chains for most of these products is really important because they hold really unique and individual knowledge. And the type of extent of gender differences and preferences was very different by country and product. So we couldn't, again, generalize some of this, that we had to look at case by case to really draw out the differences. And this is work that's currently led by Laura Forsyth, that we're looking to publish this comparative study around the different RTP crops across sub-Saharan Africa. So next, moving into this left-hand, an idea of the different words and the descriptors for characteristics of the ideal varieties of these different root and tuber, especially cassava for this work, is now understanding, okay, there may be a list of 20 different traits. How important are these traits to whom? So we're using a method called 1000 Minds, which is a choice experimentation based method. It's been used in marketing for just different products, and it's been applied to animal breeding, and it's the Abacus Bio is our partner there, and we're applying it to crops across multiple crops right now, and cassava is one of the first use studies. So the idea really here is, first you try to get a short list of traits that you want to work with, then you have to define the units of those traits and the change in units as you're kind of asking respondents to trade off different scenarios. What that means is you can have, when you ask a respondent, would you like kind of 25% more roots versus 10% less disease resist or less infection. So you kind of ask respondents to trade off different scenarios and do that over and over again with the trait units changing, up or down depending on the first decision made. What that really does is it kind of gives you an ultimate rank of the traits for all the respondents, but it also gives you economic weights because you look at the economic value. You do a lot of baseline work through focus groups and interviews to understand the economic values of each of the traits. This is work that, at least for NEXTGEN Cassava, is driven by Ireti Balogun in Nigeria, and that's the results that I'll be referring to. So when you look at all of the respondents in Nigeria, and we had about 1,000 odd respondents that we tried this method with in Nigeria, when you look at the big picture and step back, you see that there are three broad categories. Respondents that care about quality. So these are the traits around Gari, which is the major product of Cassava in Nigeria. And there were the respondents who care more about output. So how much absolute output you're getting in terms of yield, root size, dry matter content. And then there were respondents who were caring more about survival. So disease resistance and storability were being more highly ranked in those groups. So what's interesting is if you take these three groups now and look at the demography, again, the kind of who is making these choices and who's represented in these three different groups, you see that women are overrepresented in the quality group. And that's not surprising, again, because their role in cassava processing, they're probably more involved in quality, the interfacing with the quality than the men are. But again, the intersectionalities, it depends on who you are along the value chain, also has significant impacts on which group you're falling into. And also the age matters, as does region and access to improved varieties. So it's not a simple picture to be able to say everyone falls in this group depending on if they're this or that we really have a lot of different variables that we're looking at that are driving these choices. So kind of the next phase of this work that Ireti is digging into right now is, as we said, looking at men and women more broadly is interesting because we don't want to develop one typology for everyone in Nigeria, but what happens if we disaggregate the responses by sex, by region, by value chain role? Do we see differences? So does that PCA look different if we have women versus men? Does it look different if we have different regions? So she's working through that now, and I think it's really interesting to see if those typologies hold. Another thing that's really, really exciting and novel for this method is merging this data with the ROMIS data. So ROMIS is a household survey, but what it does is it generates poverty indicators for individuals and also food security indicators for individuals. What that means is you can actually place an individual in a quantile for poverty or food security. What that means is if you relate these two data sets to one another, you can actually start saying women in the southeast of Nigeria in the lowest quantile for poverty, this is what their typology looks like. So that at each step of disaggregation, obviously you lose a lot of power, but we have the data set to be able to play around with this and really refine this method, which is very, very exciting. What also we're innovating on this 1,000 Minds, and this is work led by Olamide Olasebakan at IITA Nigeria, Tessie Madu at NRCRI, and Elizabeth Garner is a postdoc working with me at Cornell. They're looking at how we apply 1,000 Minds and what that means from an inter-household perspective. So in practice, usually you would talk to one member of the household, and that member of the household traditionally for surveys is chosen as being the head of household. And usually de facto that's a man. So there's a lot of push in economic literature to say we need to be intentional about speaking to not just women who are heads of household, but spouses of household heads. So how do the spouses, the husband and wife, relate to another in responding to surveys? So we've done this with 1,000 Minds. We've interviewed the husband, we've interviewed the wife in about 360 households, and we've interviewed the couple. So what that means is we have responses from the husband, the wife, and a negotiated couples interview. And the reason why we wanted to do is see if there are any shifts. So if you have individual responses and a negotiated response, what does the negotiated response look like? Does it look more like the man's response or look more like the women's response? And what does that mean for the method? What we saw is sure enough, there are individually significantly different rankings for profitability and maturity that men were preferring, and product quality, again, that women were preferring. Kind of, we already know that. But then when you come together as a couple, if you listen to these transcripts, you hear the men doing a lot more of the speaking. So our assumption was that the negotiated response would look more like the men's response. But what we really found is that that's not true. So in the negotiation, women's response, the couple response is more towards whoever feels more strongly. So their profitability and maturity, if it was lower ranked for women in the individual, in the couple's response, that was kind of shifted upwards because the men felt strongly about that, and vice versa. So it was kind of an equal shift, which was really interesting. So the last part is this on-farm performance trials, just to kind of triangulate these articulations of preference with choices made on farm with varieties. We've decided to adopt this on-farm trial method called TRICOT. Some of you may have heard of this, and this is Jacob van Etten. This is his paper from 2017 describing TRICOT, and he really frames it as a problem of the quote-unquote classic way of doing on-farm trials is they're high costs, they have limited scale, the data quality may be low, and you may get limited learning. So he's kind of brought in the citizen science approach saying, you know, this is a turn of the century, this experiment, if you weigh a bull versus you ask 800 individuals to guess the weight of the bull, you may arrive at the same estimation. So the solution offered by TRICOT is really that you take you really step back as a researcher and you give farmers varieties, and the farmers manage those trials. And they're farmer leads who collect the data, not researchers. And the participation itself is the main incentive, and the participants are counterparts in the research. So when you kind of frame this and do the initial contact with the participants, that it's framed as being a research activity, and that as citizen scientists, you know, they're collaborating in this research activity. There's very little supervision or training that happens, and you kind of let the process unfold. The interesting parts of it, I think, are that you give 3 varieties per farmer. These are blind, so the farmers don't know which varieties they are, and they only rank for best and worst at overall or each time point, however you choose. And each farm is an incomplete block, so we had up to 30 to 50 reps across different farmers for different varieties, depending on how you design it. And you have a sequentially balanced design so that you make sure that you have replication across different regions, for example, depending on different product uses in different regions. And the bottom line is you really embrace variation in the environment and crop management, and don't try to control for it. So if you're interested, this is a paper from 2019 from Jacob and his team and PNAS, and they really showed how the method played out for beans in Costa Rica, for durum wheat in Ethiopia, and for bread wheat in India, looking at how different varieties, the different colors of different varieties, how they were performing across the different regions for these 3 different crops. So again, we try to do things a little bit differently with TRICOT. So talking to Jacob, we try to understand, first of all, how participants were selected, and if we can do that a little bit differently. So instead of relying on village leads or lead farmers to kind of recruit participants, we made sure that we did a lot of groundwork through interviews and focus groups to understand the diversity in each of the communities that we worked in. So we didn't only have geographically representative sampling, but we also looked at the differences in wealth, sex, age, migration status, religion within each community, so that the host farmers were chosen to reflect that diversity. And this is really important because sometimes you just don't know who's being selected, and if we're not intentional, we may be missing out on key insights from marginalized populations that wouldn't have been included if the choice were random. We also, again, because the same individuals who were participating in TRICOT were also answering the 1,000 Mind surveys, we have this really kind of in-depth understanding of their social identities, but also their demographics and their typologies of. What we did was maybe having too much data that we had multiple time points, and in each time point, multiple traits that we were ranking best and worst for. So we end up with really a large and complex data set. So this is ongoing, and the data is being analyzed by Samuel Anbuka at NRCRA in Nigeria, Stephen Angadubo in Uganda, and Kawe, who works with Jacob to help us analyze these large data sets. And I'll be showing very first pass data for mostly first and third month because the trials just concluded this summer, so we're still working through the data. And this is kind of what you see. You get net favorability scores for varieties, and you see how those play out over time. So for example, if weed competitiveness is if a variety is performing very well in a certain time point, does that play out across time? Does that explain overall selection, for example? Because at each time point we have trait rankings, but we have overall rankings as well. So this is kind of what the data looks like. And we also look at if there are correlations between, for example, this is for cooking quality for boiled cassava in Uganda, if any of the individual traits are kind of explaining that overall performance, and we're seeing that be very variable across time points. But in terms of bringing in some disaggregation by sex, it's a little bit more difficult. So we have to work with Jakob and his team to tease out some of these effects. But what Kawe has done is actually look and see, at least disaggregate by sex. And what we're seeing is kind of interesting methodologically is that women are more consistent in the varieties that they're ranking for individual traits at 1 and 3 months match their overall rankings for those same varieties. So they're kind of more consistent in ranking the varieties. And the last part of this is of course we have on-farm trials. We don't want the process to be extractive, and we want to give feedback to communities and continuously engage with them, because we'll also have another round of these trials next year. So we're right now developing, and this is work led by Olamide again and Bella Obalore and IITA in Nigeria, trying to develop these feedback guides for lead farmers and for focus group facilitators, to really understand how do we give feedback to the farmers who participate, and how do we engage them to validate or to give insights on what the findings that we're bringing back to them. So we have about 10 participants, and the results will be presented both visually and orally. And the participants, of course, are given an opportunity to exchange planting materials and experiences through these events. And the idea is to really create inclusive and safe feedback platforms for discussions to see if the results really reflect participants' experiences, and to maybe counterbalance leader effects, because every 10 farmer the data is managed by 1 lead farmer per every 10 farmer. So we want to make sure that there are no leader effects in the data that we're getting. And that the participants really feel contribution to the process and the outcomes. So there's an opportunity to feedback and alter the outcomes. And this really strengthens relationships and trust for the next phase of TRICOTs that will be planted in April, May. So again, at the end of it, as I come to the conclusion, how do we make sense of all of this? And as I was thinking this through, I thought there are 2 levels to really thinking about. One is really systems level. So we know that there are pervasive gender issues in agriculture globally, and that these are reflected in plant breeding. And if we want to address the needs of women and girls intentionally in crop improvement, we really need to take a step back and look at our priorities, our power and processes in current breeding systems. And that we really need to invest more in gender-focused studies to help fill some of the evidence gaps that I was alluding to earlier. And I think interdisciplinary teams are absolutely non-negotiable to be able to breed for intentional social impact, and that some of the methods that you use would have to be themselves interdisciplinary, because who you ask and how makes all the difference to the information that you're getting. And I would say the biggest challenge we currently face, and especially the NEXTGEN work over the next year, is making sense of these multiple data streams to really distill down into actionable breeding targets. And I think that in itself is going to be a significant task that we may again have to innovate around a little bit. And I think as individuals, especially in this plant breeding seminars for students as well, is to understand that as researchers, we all carry internalized biases, stereotypes, and positions, and whether we realize it or not, these implicitly drive our work. So kind of being aware of that, I think, is really important as we try to shift the narrative to be more inclusive and to be more impactful in our plant breeding work. And that challenging our assumptions and working with people outside of our comfort zone is really half the battle, because it is not easy to have these conversations. And I would just like to make a call for, often I hear it's just too complex, the social context is too complex, we can't handle it. But I'd like to just make a call to say we should try to embrace the social complexity as much as we embrace the genetic complexity in breeding, and try to understand it and model it and respond to it to be more effective in our breeding programs. So with that, I'll say thank you and start taking questions, and say that there are probably far too many people to thank on one slide, but I want to really say Margaret Mangeni and her team at Makerere for doing a lot of the gender training around agricultural research and plant breeding more specifically, the NEXTGEN Cassava teams in Nigeria at NRCRI, at IITA, at NACRI in Uganda, and also TARI in Tanzania for doing a lot of the field work and generating this huge amount of data. And as we set out for the new Feed the Future Innovation Lab for crop improvement, to Miguel, Elizabeth, and Sergio for sitting together and trying to understand this big problem and how we can build frameworks that are consistently gathering evidence for informed decisions. So with that, I'll thank you and take questions.
Can I ask a question? All right,
Rebecca,
excuse me,
are you moderating or?
oh, sorry, I just wanted to, I'm sorry, was I on mute that whole time?
Yes.
Oh, I'm really sorry. Oh, I'm just on display as like for total incompetence. Sorry, Jean-Luc, before I hand the floor to you, let me just say that I was trying to thank you for your profoundly thoughtful and thought-provoking presentation, and the way that you brought these issues of diversity, equity, inclusion that I think are on top of mind for a lot of people with Black Lives Matter moment, but and more specifically bringing them to the bringing out this range of ethical, but also very, very practical ways in which gender considerations are important in plant breeding. And I wanted to just thank you for bringing the rich experience from the gender responsive researchers equipped for Ag Transformation Project, great, and NEXTGEN Cassava, and also the Feed the Future Lab for carbon improvement, and also the tuber banana work from the CG. You've been through your international activities, you brought this wealth of experiences and also evidence for a new and exciting toolkit that is leading to these really powerful findings. So the question that I want to put on the table is, what do you see as the implications for the training that we as a section bring to plant breeders, and also to plant scientists more generally in SIPs? Like, can you comment on how you see, like, how we should think about confronting our own curriculum and opening up this box more, this toolkit that you've highlighted here? How should we be looking at our curriculum, our training process to do better at both the ethical and practical aspects that you have so brilliantly highlighted?
Thank you, Rebecca. I think that's such a great question. And one thing I have to say to start off is I think Makerere University does a better job than we do. And for me, it's been such an inspiration to watch how, gender and social difference issues are really spread across a lot of the curriculum. It's kind of a non-negotiable. And I look at that and I think, why aren't we doing that? And I think it's not just about gender in our case, but it is about race. It is about systematic racism. It's about representation. If you've been to these biodiversify workshop, for example, querying curriculum and looking at it with a critical angle to say who's being represented and heard and how and why is something I really think we have to do for all of SIPs, but maybe for plant breeding, we can start with kind of a smaller unit and looking at our curriculum with that lens on and seeing what are some of the concepts and assumptions and representation that's coming through our curriculum, and is that how it should be coming through? So I think it's really important. I think we can also have targeted modules or courses looking at these issues, because what a lot of times I get asked is, what does this look like domestically? And you probably won't be very surprised that women and underrepresented minorities in the US have exactly the same problems that I'm talking about. Lack of access to finances, smaller land holdings, lower profitability, lack of access to resources and networks. So it's not an international problem. And I think that needs to come a little bit more to the fore as we think about how we're doing our work. So I think two sides: one, just looking at the existing curriculum, and two, generating new curriculum to specifically address diversity and inclusion in all of the work that we do would be ideal.
Jean-Luc, over to you.
Yeah, I had essentially the same question as you did, Rebecca. I was starting from the perspective of, unless I'm mistaken, within plant breeding and genetics, we don't have any course that would hand over the knowledge and expertise that you just demonstrated to our students. And how much of a problem is that? Obviously, it's a big problem. Although you framed it much more as wanting to have it pervade the whole curriculum, as opposed to a single course that would be about, your 3 slices of the pie that you showed over your talk. But anyway, if you have any comment, go for it.
Yeah, okay, so 2 thoughts. I think both are needed, because what you see a lot as well is quote unquote siloing of gender research. And you see that internationally a lot. There's a gender expert or a gender researcher, and they're kind of in their own corner and they're fighting their own battles. And the larger teams around plant breeding and agronomy are kind of hearing it, but not really completely taking everything on board. I would like to avoid that happening in the curriculum, where you have like the diversity course and then everything else, right? So I think we need to have those specific courses, but we also need to look at the full curriculum. So I think both of those are needed for different reasons.
I'm just going to call Nick. Would you mind articulating your question, or do you want me to read it?
Oh, I was just, thanks for the talk. I was just interested in like how long it, I mean, because improving for an agronomic trait, you know, can take several years, and just wondering if you see improving for these traits to be faster or slower.
That's a great question. There is an assumption, and I like to flag assumptions, but there are assumptions that it's much more costly to do this kind of work. And I'd like to challenge that a little bit, because I think the opportunity cost, I mean, the potential flip side of it is we're completely missing our target. So what's the cost of developing something that's not being adopted versus taking a little bit more time and more upfront investment to presumably develop things that will be adopted more readily? Again, that's a logical leap. But I don't really have a dollar value attached to saying this kind of research versus this. But what we are doing is looking at costing all the models in NEXTGEN, all the methods that we're using, to see what is the cost to the breeding program, because ultimately we want these methods to be sustainable and applicable, right? We can't say we're going to do TRICOT forever, the grant ends, what happens? Is this really a method that is cost effective? And is the information coming out interesting enough for that investment? So we are modeling that within NEXTGEN, or we intend to at least. So I don't have the answer broadly, but I think within a project, we can start looking at that very question.
And Ed, do you want to speak your question? Ed's asking how to make the social side high throughput. Over to you, Ed.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the question I have, I agree, these are incredibly complex systems, just like genetics is, and we need to embrace that complexity. But I would part of the way we've made progress in genetics is having been able to scale and get enough data to deal with it. And we see that social manipulation side working in like how Google does ads or Facebook, but those are not necessarily for positive goals. How do we scale this type of thing for positive goals so we can, you have enough observations in each one of these categories to make statements? I mean, how do you get 500,000 observations?
Two sides to the answer to that question is, if you look at the social science, and I can't speak for all social scientists because I'm not one, but what I understand from a lot of the work is there's quantitative social science and there's qualitative social science. And then there's mixed methods or interdisciplinary social science, right? So the numbers are really important for the quantitative work, which means, you want the hundreds and the thousands to be able to have enough power to make inferences on a quantitative hypothesis that you're trying to answer. So there you can get more numbers. You can have, quote unquote, more high throughput if you have a survey that you massively roll out. But the really, really interesting information, I think, comes from coupling that with qualitative work, which shouldn't be scaled, arguably, because it is very contextual and it's a personal case study, for example, or it's not trying to generalize, it's trying to understand. So as we get some of the numbers, and I think Google probably does the same, in terms of the numbers, you also need some more qualitative information for the hows and the whys. So I think we shouldn't necessarily try to scale all of the social science side. We can try getting more numbers, like with the 1,000 minds, the more respondents we have, the better. But then if you do the interviews and do the more qualitative work and do more on-farm trials, maybe we don't try to scale that as much, but we try to go deeper and try to couple those two. I think that's where we need a little more thought, is how those two come together and what it means for breeding. So I think like the 1,000 minds is a good example of what you're saying, is because it's coming from marketing. It's coming from that world. It's just being adapted to kind of crop improvement. So there are opportunities to adopt, but not exclude some of the qualitative work that's really important.
And Martin, want to go ahead with your questions about TRICOT?
Sure. And I kind of think they fit right in with what Ed and Nick were asking too. I was wondering about, I do think that iterating the TRICOT or doing more TRICOT, just kind of scaling up to continuously collect data are kind of interesting. So I was wondering if you have plans to like do another round, maybe with the same farmers, and whether you could, you were saying at the end of your talk about how can we provide them feedback? Can we provide them new varieties to test and see how their rankings, So yeah, that is my question.
Thank you, Martin. So we had planned in Nigeria to replicate the TRICOT twice. So with the same farmers and switching out, I think the bottom 5% or 10% of varieties, which were very consistently performing badly, so we can integrate a little more of the other next-gen varieties that are coming through the pipeline. So with minimal tweaking, we were going to kind of replicate the same exact farmers in the same system. So we will do that, but what I think is a little bit testament to the interest for this method in Uganda, it surprised me that the breeding program there said, we also want to repeat this because we think it's really interesting. So I think there may be hope for that throughput question of if the breeding program see enough value in this could be and this is where we're having conversations with people like Ismail Rabbi on the project saying, how often do you need to run these kind of on-farm trials? Do they need to happen every year, every 3 years, every 5 years? What makes sense? With what kind of regularity do you need to have this touching base with individuals? And who do you work with? Do you work with the same farmers? So what you see with Eva's work, for example, in sorghum in Mali is they had a group of farmers that they interacted with over decades, and that longitudinal deep relationship was really important in getting kind of the deeper feedback and the opening up and the trust building. So there's argument for kind of scaling out to more individuals to getting more data points versus kind of having the same individuals be your citizen science group to give regular feedback. I think that's something that we don't have an answer to right now because we're just trying it, but there is definitely at least 2 rounds that we'll get out of NextGen and then maybe beyond, hopefully.
And Elizabeth, you had asked, you had mentioned the point that plant breeders can make common cause with other units, for example, at Cornell. Do you want to enlarge on that?
Oh, thank you, Rebecca. Yeah, I just wanted to build from what Holly was already talking about and her emphasis. I really appreciate as a rural sociologist and feminist scholar about emphasizing interdisciplinary work and really building from the expertise that already exists. And so, especially thinking about curricula and who to partner with, that at least from my perspective, like I don't feel like these issues need to be all solved by plant breeders because there are so many of us already doing a lot of this work and addressing some of these complexities with some of the background, but how important it is to partner and build from the resources that already exist. So even with curricula development, maybe it's not just designing a unique course for plant breeders, but really thinking about what resources already exist at Cornell. And it's also a way to highlight and integrate the work of scholars who sometimes get overlooked or don't have the same kind of funding that plant breeders might have, for example. So thank you. And thanks, Holly, great talk.
Elizabeth is live in here. I mentioned her several times in the talk, but I think it's interesting, like Elizabeth's saying, is we often have these conversations between us coming from very different angles. And it's a really interesting exercise. And I really agree with you that more systematic linking with FGSS or Africana would be very interesting, I think, for us as a unit.
And I think the work that you presented really highlights not only the need to have different sorts of scholars and scholarship in the mix, but also different kinds of organizations out there in the world that just like in order to pull off a good TRICOT approach, I expect it would be helpful to have strong relations with community-based organizations that can support the farmers to have a deeper experience through the work and to participate at a more profound level, not just testing out 3 things. So anyway, Holly, I think we're running out of time here. And again, I would like to really thank you so much for a fabulous talk and bringing that breadth of fantastic experience that you have to this dimension of crop improvement that, again, can improve the way that our field benefits other people and the way that we also benefit from better engagement in terms of getting our job done. So thanks so much, Holly. Really fantastic talk, and I really appreciate it very much. I hope we can continue this conversation about how to bring these messages into our training and practice.
Thank you, Rebecca, for the invitation, and thank you for your time.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.